Welcome everyone to another episode of the Dragonus Podcastus. My name is Dead Ponic, and I'm going to introduce my lovely assistant and current co-host, actually future co-host, Lady J. Together, we're going to take the One Ring to Mordor, and hopefully not run into any issues along the way. If you want to support the podcast, you can do so through the Patreon, the Fiverr page. We are working on the T-shirts and the bingo card, so stay tuned for that. So, Lady J, first of all, welcome. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself before we actually get started with the episode?
Well, my name is Jay. I've been playing TTRPGs since 1988 and started DMing my own games in 1992. I run games in my own world and currently have 6 active games. My world is a high fantasy homebrew world called Blue Loka. It consists of 9 countries, 4 realms, and has its own lore and uses the D&D system of play.
So, we're going to try a new thing here. We're going to be asking rhetorical questions, kind of like the Geico commercials. Could changing your dice rolling technique really save you from a nat 1?
Does it take 2 to tango?
Who knows? Anyway, so now there isn't really an easy way to kind of ease you into the world. So, and I initially just wanted to go full on every faction in a nutshell. However, since we've been talking about evil factions a lot in the past couple episodes, I figure let's go a little bit deeper. So for this episode, we are actually going to be talking about the Elven Civil War again. I did a previous episode. I'm re-updating it now. And to start off, I have a quote. Evil is not defined by actions but by belief. If a general can raze a city to the ground yet leave the denizens unharmed, he is considered merciful. The moment one innocent dies, though, he's declared a monster for eternity. And yet in war, there's no such thing as the innocent. Denizens of a kingdom are guilty of allowing their leader to rule over them and declaring said ruler as wise.
Well, the idea of evil comes with the concept of intent. Also, there is an element of perception and belief when it comes to evil. If the intent is to harm and the person believes that what they are doing is for the greater good, for a sense of justice or to right a wrong, they may not view their activities as inherently evil. However, the faction or enemy they face may not agree with their perceptions or beliefs and view their actions as inherently evil. After all, history is written by the victors, not the losers.
And to quote a famous captain, history is filled with liars. Anyway, so the Elven Civil War was not kicked off by a coup or an assassination. It was started by one person's attempt to place high elves at the top of the figurative totem pole. But to understand that, you have to understand what was going on at the time, which was about 50, 60 years ago, give or take within this timeline here. So there is a figurative totem pole about how the elves conducted themselves and where they considered themselves, who they considered like at the bottom, kind of like a caste system, if you will. At the very tippy top, you've got the wood elves, and initially they ruled over the kingdom. They established the territorial borders. And they also produced the most prolific druids and hunters. They're also the ones that established the whole thing with the city in the or the houses in the trees. Then you've got the high elves. These guys are the magic users, and almost every high elf has a magical talent of some kind, and they use their magic to make sure that nobody can chart their cities on a map to prevent invasion. Kind of like a magical version of the neuralizer from Men in Black. And when you think of elves in fantasy, these are generally the guys you think of. They always have that we are better than the other races because we're immortal and we have the power of foresight and pointy ears, basically. Then you've got, in the middle, you have the sun and moon elves. And they kind of keep the balance of things, but most notably, they produce the most potent seers and healers. And they see things with a very pragmatic viewpoint. To quote a famous elf, the mirror shows many things that were, things that are, and some things that have not yet come to pass. Then you have the aquatic elves. They actually, through their magic, they were able to basically, like, put a full lake into the Elven Kingdom, but nobody else knows where it is except for the other elves. And they just, they buggered right off because they love the sea more than they love those damn landlubbers. And then you got two more. You got the Drow. They showed the Elven peoples that the shadows are not something to be feared, but accepted as a natural part of things. And they taught them the value of avoiding being seen. Most of the other elves kind of avoid the Drow for various reasons, because they have a very bad reputation. But the Sun and Moon elves were among the few that actually showed them compassion and kindness. And to quote another famous Lord of the Rings character, I can avoid being seen if I wish, but to disappear entirely, that is a rare gift. And they, like another class of elves that we're going to talk about in a minute, they saw the threat that was looming, and they simply just vanished. They went to live in a secretly built city that they had built ahead of time in the Underdark, known simply as Ravenholm. And then finally, you have the Red Elves, because God forbid YouTube lets me say Blood Elves, but the Red Elves, they showed the other sub races of elves how to live off the land, learn to ride beasts, namely horses, and other wildlife, and most importantly, how to forge friendships. Unfortunately, they also saw the threat on the tree, and they bailed, but not before being caught up in some of the first massacres that actually sparked the Civil War.
So, is this a magic tree, a metaphor? What do you mean by they also saw the threat on the tree?
Well, it's another expression. It's a metaphor, like saying seeing the writing on the wall, basically. Except the Red Elves, they're more in tune with nature, not as much as the Wood Elves, but they can like they can pick up, like, say an acorn, and they can see things that most people would not see. They're kind of like that. Whereas the Wood Elves, they get a lot of their like searing stuff from actual animals more than anything else. Now, the big question here is, what actually caused the Civil War? Now, the war itself did not just appear out of nowhere. It was brought about by conniving and evil forces which were warping and twisting the mind of one man, and his name was Beldrar. Beldrar was a high elf, and he was one of the high elves who was not necessarily magically inclined as many others of his subrace, but he did have the gift of charisma. I guess you could say that is his magical talent, but the other people didn't think so. Think of Beldrar like in his early days, like J.J. Abrams' 2009 Star Trek Spock, where he's like quite intelligent, but he's prone to emotional like outbursts in a way. And, he gets bullied, and he's declared effectively a freak of nature, which for an elf, an insult like that, it means a lot, and it's not fun. And then, just one day, Beldrar met a wisp, a being that told him he was destined for greater things, and his rightful place was as king of all elven kind.
Eldar should have had rolled higher on intelligence. Many are swayed easily by the prospects of wealth, power, and money. This is the root for corruption in many fantasy and fictional genres.
Yep, pretty much. So, Beldrar gathered a loyal group of followers and basically usurped the throne, declaring himself the new leader of the elves, and he announced a little change in government, so that high elves would take priority at the top of that figurative totem pole, and everyone else below the high elves would either worship and accept Beldrar as their leader, or they would fall by the wayside. There were some that openly defied Beldrar and declared him, a traitor and a usurper of the throne. And Beldrar responded by basically beginning a campaign of genocide that makes the Great Purge look like a picnic.
Great Purge? Was this a previous event in your world? Historical timeline? Does this event also target a specific group, or was it a ideological purge, trying to purge the world of specific beliefs or ideas?
Well, when I say Great Purge, I refer to two things. The first one is more of a fictional purge, which was the Great Jedi Purge from Star Wars. Most people know it as Order 66. It has another name, which is the Great Jedi Purge. The actual historical Great Purge from real life history was conducted by the USSR under Stalin in the 20s and 30s. And basically, Stalin ordered a large majority of the Soviet Army's best military officers to basically be arrested and executed. And, well, Beldrar makes that look like kind of a picnic. Anyway, so thankfully the Wood Elves were able to basically wage a guerrilla war that the High Elves, with all their magical might, were just not able to deal with. They didn't contemplate the whole idea of guerrilla warfare. And one such example was the Battle of Pergasa Hill. The Wood Elves were basically able to take advantage of both the hill and the surrounding forest, and they basically sent in a bunch of wild shapes that turned into elephants into the enemy lines. It just, and the lines broke.
A tactic used in our world as well. Were these people who were wild shape being sent into the front lines, or were they creatures that were summoned to the front lines? Because they're two different things in like D&D. So I'm just trying to understand, like, are they people who took on the shapes or summons that were sent to the front line?
Oh no, they're actual wild shapes. They're actual like druids that are wild shapes. They actually went to the front line and they fought on the front line itself. This is actually a tactic that was used by Hannibal, where he would basically he would just send the elephants charging in and it would break up the lines, and then you'd send in the infantry and cavalry and just mob out the infantry. And so Beldrar responded to this by executing the general that took part in that battle and ultimately had to retreat, and burning multiple villages. And this series of events led to him being dubbed Beldrar the Mad.
Well, like any good villain, he exerts his will through retaliation. An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. This villain seems to be straightforward in his goals and with his actions.
Pretty much. But there was that, dark force, twisting and corrupting his mind, because we'll get to that in a little bit. And while this was going on, the other elf classes or sub-races, if you will, they made a secret pact with the humans to allow their people to take refuge in human cities. And Beldrar basically did not have the resources, much less the manpower to take on the human kingdoms at this point in time, because his forces were being decimated left and right, basically.
Well, manpower could be overrated. Sometimes the enemy doesn't have to resort to brute force. With regards to Beldar's charisma, why wouldn't he have manipulated them or offer them a much more lucrative deal? If you can perverse enough people with power in the human stronghold, which is feasible, as many may be out to save themselves. Their families are even out for power themselves. Why would he not have tried?
Well, like many high elves, he considers humans to be just basically inferior, because high elves are basically the idea of we're immortal and you guys are mortal and you will eventually die. We technically won't die. And also the whole we're greater than you kind of thing. And he didn't consider the fact that also that the humans will be able to put up much of a resistance anyways. And also he wasn't technically fully aware that the elves had actually fled the woods and taken refuge in the human cities. And even if he were to commit to trying to manipulate them, they probably would have been fully aware of what was going on because of the refugee stories and all that. So the Red Elves, they were scarred by the massacre of approximately 1.65 million of their kind. They fled to the upper plains of the continent, and they brokered a deal with the Emperor of Cimmeria and the King of Tor to allow them to have a little territory of their own where they could be safe, basically.
Why did they choose to run there? Was there an economic, military, or terrain advantage for being there?
There was mostly a terrain advantage, because I liken the Red Elves to kind of like the is it Comanches? I believe it's the Comanche Native American tribe. Basically, they learned to live off the land, and they would basically that area is like it's got rolling hills, it's got plains, it's got everything they need, and so there is a terrain advantage. There's also a tactical advantage where it's mostly flat, so you can see the enemy coming. As for economic, they don't really trade much because they don't have much to trade. They just kind of live off the land in a way. And then, so meanwhile, the Drow met with the leaders of all the other sub races and some of the high elves that had actually deserted in the far reaches of the Underdark, and they basically tried to discuss a plan to take back their kingdom, but first they had to actually take out Beldrar. And this alliance, known simply as the Curved Moon Conglomerate, managed to convince one of Beldrar's top generals to betray him after revealing that, his village and all the people in it were wiped out. And the Drow managed to assassinate Beldrar and the High Elf armies without their leader. The High Elf armies basically just surrendered. Basically,
How did they achieve this exactly? Like numbers, wit, or advancements that the other side didn't have? Espionage?
it's a little bit
How
of
did they do it?
everything. A little bit of everything. So you have your conventional army, which was the Sun, Moon, Wood, and Red Elves, and they basically would engage the High Elves, and then the Drow would basically go in, take various necessary equipment, and also some intelligence, and they actually were able to get the intelligence they needed to get close to Beldrar in order to assassinate him, essentially. And once news reached the High Elves that Beldrar was dead, they basically just they surrendered. They had no leader. They had no grand supreme commander to guide them, basically. And then so the first order of business after that was to get rid of that figure of totem pole and establish a 4-leader council so that no one person would ever be in charge. And then the next order of business was to bury Beldrar, and he was sealed in a tomb deep within the bowels of something called the Curved Hill. His body, along with a list of all the horrible acts he perpetrated and ordered, was sealed in that tomb, and powerful spells were placed on it so that no one would dare try to enter. However, a nameless threat, came upon this tomb, broke it open with all its dark might, and claimed Beldrar's body and soul. Beldrar was officially dead, but he would become one of a number, one of 12.
Okay, so I'm gonna break this apart a little bit because I have a few questions. There was a lot of information in that. What happens during a tie in decision making when you have an equal number of people on a council or government body?
Well,
How do
generally,
they
sorry.
tie?
So basically, to answer that first question, basically they try to come to some kind of agreement, or if there is a tie in decision making, they will try to find a compromise of some kind.
And if that compromise can't be reached?
Well, then they'll find some way, or they'll get a third party, like, because the Red Elves, they don't technically live in the kingdom anymore. They'll get like somebody from the Red Elves to come in and give a kind of a third party perspective, like try to mediate things in a way and get like their perspective on how they should do things.
Okay. So the next thing I have is why bury him rather than destroying the body altogether? Why would they bury him with that additional information? I mean, if I were to bury someone I didn't want to be found, resurrected, or be brought back somehow, I would have either done what they did, but not with all of the very identifiable information. I also would have had made the history widely available to those that too helped kind of deter them from seeking the body out, painting him as a demon or an unnatural force that could destroy the world. So most wouldn't go out and seek him. That's not to say that some wouldn't, but it would just to deter most people, or just to destroy the body completely? Like, why that choice?
Well, that the elves don't believe in, just cremating a body. They do believe in actual burial. Um, as for, why they would bury him with that information, it's so that anybody who does come upon that tomb, they'll read that and they're like, oh, so this is what this person did, and they'll realize, oh, maybe it's not a good idea to raid or plunder his tomb of any kind. He didn't have many possessions that were buried with him, but besides, just his armor and all that. But it's supposed to deter. Also, that spell that I mentioned is designed specifically so that nobody can actually break into the tomb unless you're like incredibly powerful, or you just so happen to have a wizard who happens to be able to unlock it. Or you're just really you're like evil and you're really powerful as an evil being, such as the basically the spirit, the shadow that came and claimed him. They did tell the story, like they did tell what happened, and they told everybody they could about Beldrar to say, hey, just because we're elves and just because we kind of shut ourselves off from the world in a way doesn't mean we don't have our own problems. Like, for example, like we just got out of a civil war, and yeah, we didn't necessarily need your help, but we could have asked for it, but we realized, oh, this is kind of our problem. We don't want to get the other races involved, basically. And they did, give him respect because he was ultimately corrupted. So they acknowledged that he was, a unique individual, despite the fact that, he wasn't as magically inclined. And yeah, just to answer that other question, they don't believe in, utterly destroying the body. And they don't consider it sacrilegious or taboo. It's just something they don't do, basically. So the Elven Civil War at that point was over, and 78 million elves lost their lives in this conflict. Their kingdom was wrecked with the fires of war, and all because of one man and the dark corruption that took his mind.
It's always a man, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yep. Yeah, so as I said before, so his body and soul were claimed by a shadow, and he became one of 12. Now, we'll talk about this in another episode, but basically he becomes an equivalent of a Nazgul, except, there's a little bit more to it. So yeah, that is the Elven Civil War. And before we wrap up, what are your thoughts on this whole thing?
I think it's pretty good fleshed out. I am curious about the one of 12, what that is referencing, so I'm looking forward to that. I personally, I find it, really rich in kind of details, and I think that's really good when especially if you're trying to host something that is a fantasy realm, a TTRPG, or if you're running a campaign that's, you want various things to happen, and there's different layers that are usable here. So I think that is actually really wonderful in the way that that's done.
So next week we will, I'm not going to reveal what we're doing next week, but next week we're doing another evil faction, and it's gonna be fun. So we'll see you guys next week, and yeah, we'll see you guys next week, and officially Lady J is now our the co-host, and hopefully we'll get more. She'll get used to this. Don't worry. We'll see you guys next week.